Reading from Haggai 1. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your panelled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. I call for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and on all the labor of your hands. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month.
All right, so over the school holidays, whilst people are travelling, we wait for the new term to start. We're going to do a short 2-week series looking at this book of Haggai. This small book is in the Old Testament, it's right near the end of it. And in the Bible's timeline of events, it's wrapping up what happened to the Israelites in their wait for the Messiah, for Jesus, to come. So it's speaking of a time in their history when Israel is very weak, and it is looking at this prophet whose name is Haggai, and the message he brings to God's people at this time about what they now need to do to be living for God and to be trusting in the promises that God has been giving them about their future hope during what is this time of need, right? How they can actually stay strong in their faith, whilst as a nation, they're actually anything but strong. They're at the weakest that they've really ever been since they started. Now, as we read through the Old Testament from start to finish, we first read about this man, Haggai, in what is called the book of Ezra. And we'll refer to Ezra several times as we go through this book over the next couple of weeks, as what we see here in Haggai was all actually happening in that part of Israel's history that Ezra records. So this week, if you've got some spare time, you might want to read over what is this pretty short book, Ezra, and maybe even Nehemiah as well, which continues straight on from it. Or maybe even over the next couple of books in the Old Testament order after Haggai, being Zechariah and Malachi, as they're all dealing with this same time period of waiting for the Messiah to arrive, whilst Israel is in this point of struggle and rebuild. And as the book is dealing with this moment when God's people were at their weakest, really, the main theme of what we'll be looking at is the need to prioritize God first in our lives, and also to trust in him in all circumstances. Because when we look at these 2 chapters, we see a message is being given to what is a demotivated and a lost people who have seemingly given up trying as all hope appears to be gone, right? They keep thinking back to better days, and now they're seeing how far they've fallen and how hard things now are for them. But despite what is their present situation, the message to them is to not do that, to not despair. They're to know that God really is with them, and that they have to be therefore putting him first, and that they will have to then see that God has not abandoned them. If they put him first, they'll come to realize he is very much still there. And this theme of living for and trusting God, well, it actually links in pretty well, I think, with much of what we've just spent the last term looking at, which was the book of Galatians. In Galatians 6:9, near the end, we read there, it said, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." And as we looked at, as we went through that passage, that verse, we saw that it was focused on striving for God, right, now, today, and to be living by his ways in all things, as our eyes are actually meant to be on the future and not just for the things in this life right now in the present. Hence why in the chapter before that, in chapter 5, verse 5, it talked about how all our hope is actually in Christ as we long for the day of his return, and we actually live for that day now, which is why when we get to the end of that letter of Galatians in 6:15, it says what counts is the new creation. So we're living in hope of that as we no longer are living for this world, and that's because we've already been made new by God. We're already halfway there, and now we're just waiting for the fulfillment of it all. And we're really seeing what is a fairly similar message being given to the Israelites back here. All right, what Haggai is saying to the Jews here is that they need to be prioritizing God now and be living for the promises that he has made. So don't give up on hope. Don't give up hope today. Keep pushing, keep trusting, no matter what the current circumstances might be. And really, this is a message that, as we'll see, applies to God's people throughout history, right? It applies to everyone. It's the same message for ourselves as well, and everyone who says that they're a child of God. So with that quick outline of what this is all about and what we'll be looking at over today and next week, the first thing to look at this morning is a little bit more detail as to what is going on when this book was written, right? What is the context of the situation that's caused this despair? We've already given the quick outline, but we need to look a bit deeper and beyond just Haggai in order to understand the message given here. So just a quick recap of what has happened in the lead up to this book. We know that in around sort of the early 700 BC time period, that what was the northern kingdom of Israel, it's wiped out by the Assyrians, bringing what is that half of the kingdom of God's people to an end. Right, this people of the northern kingdom, they're either going to be killed, and those who weren't, they were taken either captive, taken away, never to officially return to their homeland, whilst others who did actually remain in that area during this time when it was wiped out, well, they ended up just simply living with their invaders and all those who moved into that area, and it became a real cultural mix with them. And they became what we know in the New Testament as the Samaritans, right? This is now basically a new group of people who were once Jews, part of that kingdom of Israel, but they've mixed in with all the others who have now conquered their land. But then over just a century later, the southern kingdom, it's also attacked, this time by the Babylonians, and there too, many of them were killed or taken captive. And those who were taken, they were brought back to Babylon, where they've lived in exile for decades. And that's what we read about in the book of Daniel. We see this time of exile in Babylon. But in contrast, this is where the difference is. In contrast to the northern kingdom, they were allowed to return. It was decades later, but they're allowed to come home. And this is because the Persians, they conquered the Babylonians. And as we read in books like Ezra, King Cyrus of Persia, he permitted the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. And he even actually says to them, he says, I want you to rebuild your temple, right? That he wants them, this king of Persia wants them to do this, and he's even going to actually help them make that happen. So when we read Ezra, when we start at chapter 1, right at the beginning, verse 2, King Cyrus says this. It's a pretty massive claim. He says, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah." So here we've got the people of the southern kingdom which is known as Judea, right? Hence why they're now called Jews. They're the Jews of Judea. They've come back to Jerusalem, and by what is this foreign king's decree, they're allowed to rebuild their nation, and also they've now got a responsibility to rebuild the temple, right? He especially has told them to do this, as he's actually stated that God himself has appointed him to make this happen, which is where we're now coming into this book here, right? This book of Haggai is written after this return, and it speaks of the time that the Jews are now rebuilding their city. They're getting Jerusalem back started again. And just in the first verse, we get a lot of information and details that really gives us what is the context of this book. Once we know that history that was leading up to this, all this other stuff in Ezra and the Old Testament, we can now put this book in a very precise moment of world affairs. Because it says here, in the second year of King Darius, who's now the new king of Persia, second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month. So this gives us a time frame, first year of the 6th month in the second year of King Darius, and many have been able to work out pretty convincingly when exactly this is. But this moment that Haggai speaks of, it is apparently the 29th of August, 520 BC. And the way that this has been worked out, how we actually know this, is because we have today actually pretty accurate records of the kings of Persia, so we know exactly when Darius' second year was. So by this statement, we can know what was going on at that time in history, and if not the exact day, well, at least a year and even the month we can actually be sure about. This is all happening 520 years, half a millennia before Jesus. And as we read on that in that verse, it says here that on that day, right, 520 BC, that the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. So now what we've got here is not just the date that this is all happening, but we now really have the location as well, because he's speaking to what is the governor of Judah and also the high priest of the Jews, both of which are obviously going to be in Jerusalem. So we see that this book is written at a time not long after the Jews have returned to Jerusalem, having been exiled in Babylon for years, which is what we need to know in order to understand what is going to be spoken about here. That in this moment of time, the people are actually basically broken. They've lost so much confidence and trust in what is their purpose as this nation of God's chosen people. They're obviously happy to be home. There's no doubt about that. But they've just come out of captivity that lasted decades after they were just wiped out by this superior power. And now they've returned to what is just ruins of what was their once powerful and respected kingdom. Right? At this point of time, Jerusalem, it's been flattened. The temple itself, which was so important to the Israelites, it's been destroyed. And now God's people have returned, reminded of all that they've lost. They can clearly see they're no longer the great nation of Israel that others feared, and the temple that stood in the middle of their kingdom, it's now just rubble. Which is how we come to the big issue that Haggai is addressing here. They've been allowed to come back and rebuild, and they're slowly doing that. But whilst they rebuild their homes, they've actually been very negligent when it comes to rebuilding the temple, rebuilding God's house, what is his home. They've been rebuilding their own homes and the rest of the city, but that part of the city, the temple, it's basically still ruins. So this is why we read here in verse 2. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. So where you would think that rebuilding the temple would actually be their first priority. That now that they're home, this is the first thing they'd want to do. Well, they've instead decided that they have other issues that they want to deal with first. Hence why we now have here the prophet Haggai telling them, this is not right. God has permitted them to return, and that they should now be living in gratitude to him and not making the same mistake of their ancestors. Not doing what their people did in the first place. They got them into exile. They brought all these problems upon themselves. And then when we remember that timeline, the context and the history that we looked at a moment ago, we can see this is a serious issue of the heart. The first remnant, those who were in exile in Babylon, they came back to Jerusalem in 538 BC. And we know from Ezra chapter 3 in verse 8 and following that they started to rebuild the temple around 536 BC. So just a couple of years later after they got back. But this book and what Haggai states here, as mentioned before, is in 520 BC. So they've actually had more than 1.5 decades since they returned, since they've started rebuilding this temple. And it's actually been 18 years since they've come back from Babylon itself to get this temple built. And yet it's like they've hardly started. In fact, when we keep looking at the book of Ezra, when we get up to like chapters 5 and 6, we see that the Persian king Cyrus, the one who's gracefully let them go back, well, he even said to take all the gold and silver from Babylon, which Nebuchadnezzar had originally stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. And he says, take all that, all the gold and silver, send it back to Jerusalem in order to rebuild the temple as to how it was. So this foreign king has done everything to make this rebuilding happen. And he's even given them the support and the resources to do it. And yet after all these years, well, it still hasn't happened. It's still basically rubble. Which is why we then get God asking the question in verse 4. Is it time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? And the point being made is obviously very clear. They're focused on themselves these last 18 years, and their concern for God's house, it just doesn't exist. They've been putting in the effort needed to rebuild their own lives, but they're not been putting in the effort needed to rebuild the temple. And as we've seen, 1 Kings 6:38, that the original one, the grand temple of the Lord, the one that they all remember and speak so fondly of, the one that was made before the exile, but that only took Solomon 7 years to build. So that means they've actually had double that time, and yet they've got nowhere. And they've got nowhere as it's just not a priority. They're not focused on God, and they're not focused on the worship of God. This despite the fact that God has given them the time, 18 years to get this done. And he's even put this foreign king in Persia. He's put that man in that place at that time and given him the command to give the Jews the gold and the resources in order to rebuild the temple again. And yet here we are 18 years since returning, 16 years since they started rebuilding, and they've just done nothing. And that is because God and worshiping God, it is just not their priority. They are in no hurry to get this temple built, as God is just basically not important to them. Which is why we then see a warning given here. Because they have focused on themselves and not God, well, this has actually caused them more strife, as they're now worse off than if they just started and built this temple to begin with. That this neglecting of God that's been going on for years, it's going to lead them into the same situation their ancestors, as without God's blessing of them, they're never going to prosper on their own. The only reason their ancestors were ever what they were is because of what God gave them. So in verses 5 and 6, this is what we read. God says, give careful thoughts to your ways. You've planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. So here we're getting what is the warning and the practical consequences of not having their priorities right, of not rebuilding this temple. And what this has resulted in is God not blessing their work since they've forgotten him. And the worst part is they've forgotten him again. This is not the first time that this has happened. Because we need to remember that the only reason that the original temple was destroyed and they got taken off into exile in the first place was because of their sin, because they had walked away from God and gone their own way. And when you look back earlier on, when the nation started back at its peak, back when it was at its best, when King David and Solomon ruled, and Solomon made that first temple and made it with all the gold and silver, and there was a grand building. Well, at that time, back then, other nations very much respected and they feared the Israelites. They feared them because they knew that God blessed them and that he was with them. And yet then we see by the end, the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, they've got no respect or fear for them. They mock them. They invade them and destroy them without consequence. They destroyed their cities. They took many captive. And this was all because Israel had lost its ways, had fallen into sin, and as they had failed to stay faithful, this was a result. God was no longer protecting them and giving them all that stuff that made them great in the first place. So for Israel, it was just a result of defeat. They lost their home. They had the temple destroyed. And yet here, now we're seeing they're being given a second chance. They've been given an opportunity to get going again. And now they're wasting it. They're actually making the same mistakes again by their lack of prioritizing God. So this is why we see him say in verses 9 to 11, that whilst they thought they would get a lot, they've actually got very little because he's withheld his blessing from them. That God himself has brought drought, and they will not get what they want until they get their priorities straight. And this is why we read here, God explaining that he has done this because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. And then he says, therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew and the earth its crops. So they've returned to what is the promised land. And after all that time in exile, they've expected good things now that they've got home. They thought once they'd returned that everything would be yet again flowing with milk and honey. But the land itself is not what brings blessing to them. It's God who blesses them with this land and all that they then get from this land. Which is why we see him say back in verses 7 and 8, be careful, give careful thought to your ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be on it. So he's saying to them, he's saying, think about this, choose your path. Right? Do you willingly do this or not? Because it really is a choice. They have to want to be on the right path. They have to want to serve God by going up the mountains and getting the timber in order to rebuild this house. They have to want it. And only if they really do want it, then God will be pleased. That their actions will mean something. It will show their devotion and the fact they're back to prioritizing him and worshiping him. So this is why until they get their priorities straight, God's not going to bless them. He's not going to provide for them. They've got to learn from what is their ancestors' mistake and from the mistakes that they're starting to make again. The last 16 years, the last 18 years hasn't gone well. It's been hard. And they're making that same mistake by not making him their main priority. The issue is because they're focusing on themselves and not God, they've actually now made life harder for themselves. Being back in this homeland, what they've longed for, it itself does not bless them, as that's something that comes from God directly. And now, just like their ancestors, he won't bless them if they just keep on ignoring him. Which is why the rest of the chapter now tells us what is the impact of this warning that was given to them. Right? How did they respond to the facts now being laid out like this? They've now been told their mistake, and they've had it explained to them why their labor has been fruitless, why the last 18 years have been so hard. And now the question is, well, did they listen? Have they listened to this warning? Or like before, were they also too hard of heart to change their ways? Like their ancestors, are they just going to keep on ignoring God's warnings? So we see in verse 12, it says this. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because their Lord, their God, had sent him. And the people feared the Lord. So the good news is we actually see they responded to this warning by now getting their priorities straight. Right? They're now going to get this done right. There is a genuine desire in the people to be on the right path and to now finally start putting God first by not ignoring him any longer. Which is why we then read in verse 13, then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message to the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So now because they've focused on God, God will bless them again. And we then see in verses 14 and 15 that God is working in them to now rebuild the temple. It says here, they came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month. So if you look at the numbers there, this is just over 3 weeks after God spoke through Haggai to begin with. And they're now actually getting this done. In verse 1, it said it was the first day of the 6th month. That was when the warning was given. Look at the problems you've caused for yourself. And now here it says that on the 24th day of what is the same month, now they're actually getting out there and they're starting to rebuild the temple. So after this 16 years since they started and then did absolutely nothing, well, now in just 23 days, just over 3 weeks, they've finally started to do something about the temple. So it's taken them quite a while, right? 18 years all up and 16 since they started rebuilding the temple initially, but the people have finally realized their mistake. Finally realized trying to go their own way is futile. And if they keep doing that, it's only going to take them back to the suffering they faced before the exile and what caused the exile and what they faced on that exile. They can see now they have an opportunity to worship God again, so they need to make him the priority in their life, and they've got to stop ignoring him going forward. And that really is the main lesson here, right? The simple message here is just put the Lord first. It's make God your priority and don't go back to your old sinful ways. See, these people, the Jews who were liberated from captivity in Babylon, they longed to return home while they're in exile. They'd waited many decades to get back. And then when God put everything in place for that to happen, right? When he gave the world to this foreign king, Cyrus, who not only liberated them, but also gave them the resources and then sent them back home with the gold and the silver the Babylonians had stolen. You think of all that time, they've waited for this opportunity, and now that the moment's come to them, they actually can't be bothered to worship God. It just wasn't their priority. They longed for the opportunity, and when it came, they just lost all drive and all hope. And we see that people do the same today. This same thing happens now when we look at the church and the opportunity God gives to us right now. So throughout history, all through the world, many people have wanted Bibles. They've wanted churches to go to. They've wanted opportunity to worship God without the threat of imprisonment or even the risk of death. And then when we get to like a time and place like our own, right? A country like Australia, where everyone's got a Bible on their phone, right? It's in your pocket. You can access it at any time. And there are churches, never more than really just a couple of minutes drive in pretty much most of our major cities. And then despite the opportunity of today, we see Bibles go unread and all those churches, well, they remain half empty. And remember, it was only just 18 months ago, right, in Australia and in much of the Western world where we're all locked out of churches due to COVID regulations. And now that we're free to return, and there's nothing stopping us going to church, well, then we see that there are so many people who aren't taking that opportunity. When they're locked at home, they long for it. And now that they can, they don't go because they've got other things to do each week. And sadly, the reason why that is, well, it's obvious. It's very much the same thing we see here. God's not the priority. He's not the focus of their life. They're like Jews returning home, longing for it for decades. They waited for this moment. And then when it finally happened, they simply had other things to do. They had their own houses to attend to. Whilst the Lord's house, it remained in ruins. 18 years of just doing nothing. So the warning is people don't make God their priority. They neglect him for what is other things. And then the lesson is, well, that he must be the priority. That every person who claims to follow God, they cannot just simply ignore him. They're worshiping God. It's not something done when there is nothing else to do. But instead, he's to be the most important thing in the life of his people, as he is what life is to be all about. So really, the main message to take from this is don't make the same mistakes as the Jews here. Right? Don't make the same mistake as those who don't make God the focus of their life today. Don't have God set everything up for us, only to then turn away from the opportunities that he's given us and then just walk away from it. Instead, in contrast to that, right, be reading God's word as much as you can. Be praying to him about everything and doing this all the time. And then make sure to be coming to the Lord's house, the church, each week, as everyone needs to be making it a priority, as we need to be making him our priority. We've got to be putting him first.